Last time in Anchor 1, we looked at part 1, which was the steps of the scientific method and looking at controlled experiments. This time, what we're going to take a look at is part 2 of Anchor 1, which was all about the cell. And where we started was looking at the ideas behind the cell theory. And this theory is composed of 3 parts. All living things are made of cells. So something as small as a single bacteria to something as ginormous as an elephant. All living things are made of 1 or more cells. Number 2, cells are the basic units of structure and function. In other words, cells do the job for the organism. So for example, our brain cells perform nerve function. Our stomach cells perform digestive functions. So our cells make us up and they do all of the jobs for our body. Thirdly, cells can only come from other cells through cell reproduction. We've already talked about mitosis and cell division, and number 3 of the cell theory is talking about that. Cells replicate or reproduce from other cells. Next, in Anchor 1 Part 2, we took a look at prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. Now, this is something super duper important for preparing for the Keystone exam. They may ask you to compare and contrast these 2 different types of cells. So if you think about the big picture, scientists have taken every single organism on the face of the earth and divided them into 2 categories, prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And the easiest way to remember this is prokaryotic cells, the only type of organism you will ever find in prokaryotic cells are bacteria. So the bacteria that make you sick, the bacteria that are living all over you, the bacteria that are inside of your gut, those are prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells, maybe think eukaryotic starts with E, think everything else. So, fungi, plants, single-celled organisms that live in ponds, anything else, that you could possibly think of would be classified as a eukaryotic cell. So again, think prokaryotic cell, just bacteria, eukaryotic cells, everything else. Now, the reason that they're divided into 2 categories is because they share some similarities but also some differences. Because they are both cells, they both have cell membranes, okay, so they're enclosed by an outer layer. They both have DNA. Prokaryotic cells have DNA kind of just floating around inside of the cytoplasm. Eukaryotic cells hold their DNA in the nucleus, so it's protected in that structure. Both types of cells have ribosomes, so they both are able to do transcription and translation, so expressing genes. But the major difference between our 2 types of cells is right here. Prokaryotic cells are pretty boring. They don't really have anything. They don't have any of the organelles that we've talked about, but eukaryotic cells do. So eukaryotic cells have the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the chloroplast, the mitochondria, all of that list of organelles that we've talked about in the past. And remember, our word organelle, you see the word organ in the word organelle. So organelles are the little organs that do the jobs in the cell. Just like in the human body, our organs do specific jobs. Each of the little organelles does something. So the mitochondria makes ATP. The chloroplast does photosynthesis. So organelles each do a specific job. Next, because eukaryotic cells have all of those things inside of them, they need a lot of space, so they're a lot bigger. Prokaryotic cells, because they're kind of boring, they don't really have anything inside of them, they're going to be much smaller than our eukaryotic cells. So again, make sure that you go back and review and are able to compare and contrast the differences and the similarities between these 2 types of cells. The rest of our time in Anchor 1 Part 2 was spent going through all of the different parts of the eukaryotic cell. So looking at the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, all of the different organelles. I'm not going to sit here and read each of these to you. If you look at the next couple slides, you'll see that I've broken down all of the different organelles and what they do, all of their jobs. So your job is to go back and make sure you understand all of the different things, memorize them, get them in your head, and get all of these different organelles straight. So you might want to take some time, pause the video, and go back and look at all of the different parts of the eukaryotic cell before moving on to the next part. Now, we've already done one comparison at the beginning of these notes, and we compared prokaryotic cells with eukaryotic cells. Remember, the major difference between those two, prokaryotes are bacteria, eukaryotes are everything else. And what we're going to do now is compare an animal cell with a plant cell. Now, both of these are both types of eukaryotic cells because they both have a nucleus and they both have organelles. So eukaryotes include plants and animals. Now, plants are going to have all of the organelles that you just studied. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that the plant cell has ribosomes, it has the Golgi, it has the mitochondria, the rough ER, the smooth ER, the nucleus, and so on. So plant cells have all of the organelles except cilia and flagella because plant cells don't need to move. And in addition, they have 3 extra pieces and parts that animal cells do not have. Number 1 is the cell wall. Now, think of this. People sometimes get confused, the cell membrane and the cell wall. The cell membrane, think of it like a squishy balloon. Okay, now a cell wall is just like the walls of this classroom. They're rigid, they're straight, they make almost a box. So the cell wall is on the outside of a plant cell, and on the inside is the cell membrane, that squishy balloon. So plant cells have both. Animal cells just have the cell membrane. Animal cells are kind of circular, so they're kind of like a squishy balloon. But plant cells are going to have both. Secondly, plant cells tend to have a really large central vacuole, which is just a storage sac. It's just a big container that stores extra stuff. So it stores extra water, it stores extra enzymes. The plant cell can put wastes there, any extra food that it makes, but the vacuole is like a storage area. Thirdly, plant cells have chloroplasts. And a lot of people get chloroplasts and mitochondria confused because they both kind of have this kidney bean looking shape. Mitochondria, to pick them out, they kind of have a squiggle folded membrane inside of them. So those are the mitochondria. Those are both in plants and animals. And their job is to get energy for the cell. So this is like the powerhouse, the electric company. It's going to make ATP. Chloroplasts, and I probably should have drawn this in green because chloroplasts are green. They're usually a little green kidney bean shape like our mitochondria, but instead of having squiggles in there, they have pancake stacks almost. And this is the organelle that does photosynthesis. This is where the pigment chlorophyll is found. So chloroplasts capture energy from sunlight and make food. In other words, they do photosynthesis. So plant cells have everything that we've talked about, but they also have these extra 3 things. The cell wall on the outside, the vacuole, the big storage container in the middle, and chloroplasts, the little green organelles that do photosynthesis. Lastly, what we talked about is organization in a multicellular organism. And just like cells have the little organs inside of them to do all of the different jobs, Multicellular organisms, organisms that are many, many cells, like humans, have different types of cells that have become specialized. For example, we have brain cells that do a specific job. We have skin cells that do a specific job. And they're organized in our body in specific manners. So let's walk through the steps or the levels of organization in a multicellular organism. So firstly, if we look at the smallest level, organelles are the smallest little organs that are inside cells. So things like the nucleus, the mitochondria, the chloroplast, they're organized into a cell. When we put a bunch of cells together, they make a tissue. So if we put a bunch of muscle cells together, that's going to make a muscle tissue. For example, the muscle tissue of the heart that actually makes your heart pump. If we put a bunch of different tissues together, so if we have heart muscle tissue, we have blood vessel tissue, we have connective tissue, we put all of those tissues together, and they're going to make up an organ. In other words, the heart. So the organ is made up of a bunch of different tissues, and if we put a bunch of organs together, like the heart, the lungs, the blood vessels, the arteries, the veins, we put all of those together, that's going to make the cardiovascular system, or the organ system. We also have a digestive system, a nervous system, a respiratory system. But when we put a bunch of organs that work on the same job together, they make up an organ system. A bunch of organ systems together, and you probably can't see this very well, but if you look at your notes, if we put a bunch of organ systems together, it makes up an organism. So we put all those organ systems together, like the circulatory, the respiratory, digestive, nervous system. All of those different systems together all work together to make an organism. So if we reflect back, we started on the smallest level. We start on the level of like the nucleus. And from this list, we've built up to an organism. So that kind of concludes all of Anchor 1, specifically Part 2. Big ideas from this: make sure you definitely understand the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic. You know all of the different organelles and what they do and what they look like. And you can compare plant and animal cells. And lastly, this level or levels of organization in a multicellular organism. All right, thanks for watching.